Have you ever received a phone call in the middle of the night that completely changed your perspective about someone? A call where the voice on the other side was so broken, so vulnerable, that you immediately knew something very serious was happening? For Steph Curry, that call came on a cold September morning in 2025 at exactly 2:17 a.m. while he was sleeping deeply in his home in Atherton, California. The phone rang with that insistence that only emergency calls have. Steph woke up instantly with that startling jolt that emerges when we're torn from deep sleep. Isha stirred beside him, but didn't fully wake up. "Hello?" said Steph, his voice hoarse with sleep, still trying to process whether he was dreaming or if this was real. From the other side of the line, an unrecognizable and choked voice whispered, "Steph, it's me, Kawhi. I need your help." Great friendships reveal themselves in the most unexpected moments. And in that moment, Steph understood that he was about to witness a vulnerability that few in the world had ever seen. Steph sat up in bed immediately, completely awake. The voice he had heard wasn't that of Kawhi Leonard, the reserved and controlled athlete he had known for years. It was the voice of someone completely broken, someone who was struggling to maintain composure while his world was collapsing. "Kawhi? Man, what's happening?" asked Steph, silently leaving the room so as not to wake Isha. "Are you okay?" It was possible to perceive, even through the phone, that Kawhi was trying to control his breathing, as if he were on the verge of a panic attack. "No, I'm not okay, Steph. I never called anyone like this before, but I don't know what to do anymore." How many times in life does someone who always seemed to have total control reveal that they are completely lost? Steph went down the stairs of his house, walking to the kitchen where he could speak freely. The full moon illuminated San Francisco Bay through the panoramic windows, creating an almost surreal atmosphere for a conversation he had never imagined having. "Kawhi, breathe deeply with me, okay? You're safe. I'm here," said Steph, his voice carrying that natural calm that had tranquilized teammates in decisive moments throughout his entire career. What's most impressive is how Steph automatically switched to protective care mode, without asking questions about what had happened, focusing first on the emotional stabilization of whoever was on the other side of the line. To understand the magnitude of that call, it's necessary to understand the unusual relationship between Steph Curry and Kawhi Leonard. They had met years before, during American national team training camps, but their personalities couldn't have been more different. Steph was known for his openness, his easy smile, his ability to connect instantly with any person. Kawhi, on the other hand, was famous for his reserve, for carefully choosing his words, for maintaining a respectful distance even from close colleagues. But there was something few knew. In private moments during those camps, when cameras weren't present and performance pressure diminished, the two had developed a deep mutual respect. Something that touches deeply is discovering that apparently opposite people can find genuine connections when they allow themselves to be vulnerable with each other. Steph had always noticed that, despite his reserved personality, Kawhi observed everything around him with an almost scientific intensity. He paid attention to how Steph dealt with pressure, how he treated people who worked behind the scenes, how he maintained humility even at the height of success. In turn, Steph admired Kawhi's mental strength, his ability to perform in silence, to let the game speak for itself. There was a purity in Kawhi's basketball that Steph deeply respected. During those camps, they had had some conversations that went beyond the superficial. Conversations about pressure, about expectations, about how difficult it was to stay centered when the entire world was watching every movement. "You always seem to have clarity about what really matters," Kawhi had said to Steph during one of those conversations years before. "How do you manage to maintain that?" Naturally, this leads us to question: how many times do we admire in others the strength we would like to have in our own moments of weakness? Now, on that September morning, all those previous conversations gained completely new meaning. Kawhi had remembered that conversation, that perception about Steph's clarity, and in the moment of greatest desperation in his life, he had chosen to call the only person he thought could understand. "Steph," said Kawhi, his voice still tremulous but trying to find stability. "I know this is strange, calling like this in the middle of the night. But you're the only person I can imagine who will understand me without judging me." "Kawhi, man, you can call me any time of day or night," responded Steph, his voice loaded with sincerity. "We're brothers in this crazy journey that is the NBA. What's happening?" It was impossible not to feel that that moment was creating a bridge between two people who, despite different trajectories, shared something much deeper than just a profession. They shared the understanding of what it's like to carry expectations that go far beyond what any human being should bear alone. I don't even know where to begin," said Kawhi, and Steph could clearly hear the sound of tears being swallowed. "I feel like my world is collapsing, and I don't know how to deal with this. I need someone who understands what it's like to have everyone watching, judging, expecting you to be perfect all the time." Great friendships reveal themselves in the most unexpected moments. And Steph was about to discover that sometimes being a true friend means being available to receive someone's vulnerability when the world sees them as invincible. In that silent kitchen, with the moon illuminating San Francisco Bay, Steph Curry was about to participate in a conversation that would not only change his perspective about Kawhi Leonard, but would also reveal something powerful about what it means to support someone in the darkest moment of their life. What happened during this conversation touched not only two elite athletes, but showed the entire world what true friendship means. There is a devastating difference between the pressure we see from the outside and the real weight that someone carries inside. How is it possible that a person who seems to have total control over their life could be secretly drowning in expectations and judgments that never stop growing? Steph remained silent for a few seconds, allowing Kawhi to process his own emotions. It was a strategy he had learned over the years. Sometimes, the greatest gift we can give someone, in crisis, is simply the space to feel without judgment. "Kawhi," said Steph softly, "before anything else, I want you to know one thing. No matter what's happening, no matter what everyone is saying, you are my brother, and brothers don't abandon brothers. Great hearts offer refuge when emotional storms threaten to destroy everything." And in that moment, Steph was offering exactly that to Kawhi. From the other side of the line, Kawhi breathed deeply, as if those words had given him the first sense of relief in weeks. "Steph, I never thought I would reach a point where I wouldn't know how to deal with pressure," said Kawhi, his voice still unstable but trying to find some control. "I was always the guy who kept calm, who didn't let anything affect me. But now you're discovering that being human means that sometimes the armor cracks," interrupted Steph gently. "And that's okay, man. Everyone has a breaking point." It was possible to perceive that Kawhi was fighting against years of conditioning that had taught him that showing vulnerability was synonymous with weakness. "You know what kills me most, Steph?" continued Kawhi, and there was a raw pain in his voice that cut through the phone. "It's that I always thought that if I played well, if I was professional, if I kept my private life away from the spotlight, that would be enough. But it's not, right? It's never enough. How many times in life do we discover that following all the rules doesn't protect us from the storms that life can bring? Steph served himself a glass of water while listening, recognizing in Kawhi's voice echoes of conversations he had had with himself during his own darkest moments. "Kawhi, tell me something. When was the last time you slept through the night?" asked Steph. There was a long pause, and Steph had his answer before Kawhi even spoke. "I can't even remember," admitted Kawhi. "I stay awake thinking about how everything got so complicated so fast. How people who don't even really know me can have such strong opinions about who I am, about my choices, about my character. What's most impressive is how public exposure can transform any personal situation into a collective judgment, where millions of people feel they have the right to define who we are." "You know what's worse?" continued Kawhi, and Steph could feel that he was beginning to release emotions he had repressed for weeks. "It's seeing how this is affecting my family. My mother calls me worried. Every day. My children don't understand why Daddy is always stressed. And I don't know how to protect them from this." Something that touches deeply is realizing that, for true family men, personal pain always takes second place when they see their loved ones suffering for something that is beyond their control. Steph felt that familiar tightness in his chest that emerges when we recognize our own struggles in another person's experience. He vividly remembered moments in his own career when he had faced media storms, when every decision was publicly dissected, when he felt he was carrying the weight of expectations that went far beyond basketball. "Kawhi, can I ask you a question?" said Steph. "Of all the people you could have called today, why me?" The question caught Kawhi by surprise, and there was another moment of silence while he processed the answer. "Because," said Kawhi finally, "in all these years I've known you, you always seemed to have an internal compass that kept you centered, even when everyone was pressuring you, criticizing you, putting you on impossible pedestals. You always knew who you were underneath all of that." Naturally, this leads us to question: what leads someone to recognize strength in another person, exactly at the moment when they feel weakest? "I remember a conversation we had a few years ago," continued Kawhi, "after one of those All-Star games. You said something about how you learned to separate Steph Curry, the player, from Steph, the man. And that, when you managed to make that separation, the criticism stopped hurting so much." Steph smiled, vaguely remembering the conversation, but impressed that Kawhi had kept those words for so long. "I need to learn that," said Kawhi, his voice breaking slightly. "I need to learn to protect who I really am from all this madness, but I don't know how, Steph. I was always reserved, always kept things private, but now I feel like there's nowhere to hide. Great hearts offer refuge when emotional storms threaten to destroy everything." And Steph was beginning to understand that Kawhi wasn't just dealing with external pressure, but with a complete identity crisis. "Kawhi," said Steph, choosing his words carefully, "have you ever stopped to think that maybe you don't need to hide? That maybe the problem isn't you protecting yourself more, but you accepting yourself more?" It was impossible not to feel that that conversation was touching on something much deeper than just a temporary crisis. "What do you mean?" asked Kawhi. "I mean that you've spent your entire life trying to be perfect, trying to never give reasons for criticism, trying to control how the world sees you," explained Steph. "But what if you simply accepted that you can't control what people think and focused on living according to your own values? Kawhi remained silent for a long moment, and Steph could practically hear the gears turning in his mind. "It's easy to say that when you're you," said Kawhi finally, but without bitterness in his voice. "You were always more open, more communicative. For me, it was always different. I always thought that if I kept my head down and played well, that would be enough." "And for a long time it was enough," agreed Steph. "But maybe now life is teaching you that there's a difference between being private and isolating yourself completely, between protecting your family and carrying all the weight alone." What's most impressive is how Steph could identify destructive thought patterns in Kawhi without sounding like he was judging or minimizing his pain. "Steph," said Kawhi, and there was a new vulnerability in his voice, "I don't know if I'm strong enough to get through this. I was always the guy who solved things alone, who didn't depend on anyone. But now I feel like I'm drowning." Great hearts offer refuge when emotional storms threaten to destroy everything. And in that moment, Steph knew it was time to offer something more concrete than just words of support. "Kawhi," said Steph, with a firmness that cut through the conversation like an anchor, "you're not going through this alone. Not while I'm here." And it was in that moment that the conversation took a direction that neither of them had anticipated. From here, Steph Curry would do something that would change not only Kawhi Leonard's perspective, but would show the world the true meaning of unconditional support. There is a moment in every deep conversation when we realize we have crossed the territory of the superficial and entered a sacred space of mutual vulnerability. How is it possible that two people, separated by thousands of miles, can create such an intimate connection through only their voices? "Kawhi," said Steph, his voice carrying a determination that cut through the dawn like a lighthouse, "I want you to stop for a second and listen to me carefully. You just told me you don't know if you're strong enough to get through this. But man, you are getting through it, right at this exact moment." Steph walked to the window of his kitchen, observing the distant lights of San Francisco blinking like terrestrial stars. It was a view that always calmed him, and he needed that calm to give Kawhi exactly what he needed to hear. Great truths emerge when we stop running from our own strength. And Steph was about to help Kawhi rediscover a strength he had forgotten he possessed. "You know what I see when I look at you, Kawhi," continued Steph. "I see a guy who has faced immense pressures since he entered the league, who changed teams when he had to change, who took Toronto to the title when everyone doubted, who continued performing at the highest level even when his body was screaming to stop." It was possible to perceive that Steph was deliberately reminding Kawhi of his own resilience, using concrete examples to build a solid foundation of self-esteem. "But Steph," interrupted Kawhi, "this is different. This messes with things that go beyond basketball. It messes with who I am as a person." "And that's exactly why you're stronger than you think," responded Steph immediately. "Because you care. Because this isn't just about your career, it's about your integrity, your family, your values, and man, weak people don't carry this kind of weight. How many times in life do we need someone to show us our own strength exactly when we feel weakest?" Kawhi remained silent for a moment, and Steph could feel that something was changing in the energy of the conversation. It was no longer just despair. There was an emerging curiosity, as if Kawhi was beginning to consider a different perspective. "How do you do this?" asked Kawhi finally. "How do you manage to maintain this clarity when everyone is pulling you in different directions?" Steph smiled, recognizing that that was the real question. the one that was behind all of Kawhi's despair. "Can I tell you a story?" asked Steph. "Sure. Do you remember the 2016 finals?" Kawhi paused. "Of course. You guys lost to Cleveland." "Exactly. And you know what happened to me after that?" asked Steph, his voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely showed publicly. "I went into a depression that lasted months. I couldn't sleep. I questioned every decision I had made. I felt like I had disappointed everyone." What's most impressive is how Steph was using his own past vulnerability as a tool to create connection and hope. "I remember staying awake at 3 a.m., reading online comments about how I was overrated, how I didn't show up in big moments," continued Steph. "And you know what hurt the most? It was that a part of me was starting to believe that." "I didn't know that," said Kawhi, genuinely surprised. "Because I didn't talk about it. Because, like you, I thought I had to be strong all the time. That admitting doubts was admitting weakness. Something that touches deeply is realizing that even those we admire for their strength have gone through moments of profound questioning about their own worth." "And what changed?" asked Kawhi, and there was an urgency in his voice, as if the answer could be the key he was looking for. "My wife," responded Steph without hesitation. "Isha sat with me one night and said, 'Steph, you're fighting the wrong person. You're not fighting against the critics, the comments, the expectations. You're fighting against yourself.'" Steph stopped for a moment, letting those words penetrate. "She helped me realize that I was trying to control things that were out of my control," continued. "People's opinions, media narratives, expectations that weren't even mine. I was spending all my energy trying to manage things that shouldn't even be my responsibility. Great truths emerge when we stop running from our own strength." And Steph was sharing a truth that had completely changed his life. "So, what did you do?" asked Kawhi. "I started to focus only on what I could control. My effort, my preparation, how I treated my family, how I treated myself," explained Steph. "And you know what happened? In 2017, we won the title. In 2018, we won again. In 2022, one more." It was impossible not to feel that Steph was painting a concrete path of recovery, using his own journey as a map. "But Kawhi," continued Steph, "the most important thing wasn't the titles. It was that I learned to separate my value as a person from what happens on a basketball court. And more importantly, I learned that asking for help isn't weakness. It's wisdom." Kawhi breathed deeply, and Steph could feel that something was reorganizing in his mind. "Steph, can I confess something to you?" said Kawhi, his voice more stable than it had been since the beginning of the conversation. "Of course, man. I always admired you for that. For that capacity you have to be human, to show emotions without seeming weak. I never knew how to do that. Naturally, this leads us to question. How many times do we hide our humanity thinking it makes us stronger, when in reality, it makes us more isolated? "Kawhi, can I tell you something that maybe no one has ever told you?" asked Steph. "You can. You don't need to carry everything alone, and not needing to carry everything alone doesn't make you less of a man, less strong, or less capable. It makes you human." There was a long silence, but it was a different silence from the previous ones. It wasn't the silence of despair, but the silence of someone processing a completely new perspective. "You know what else?" continued Steph. "You called me today because, deep down, you already know you don't need to go through this alone. Your instinct brought you here, to this conversation. That's not weakness, man. That's emotional intelligence." Great truths emerge when we stop running from our own strength. And Kawhi was beginning to glimpse that maybe his real strength wasn't in enduring everything alone, but in having the courage to accept support. "Steph," said Kawhi, and there was something new in his voice. Not exactly hope yet, but at least the absence of total despair. "How do I do this? How do I stop trying to control what everyone thinks and focus on what really matters?" "First," responded Steph, "you identify what really matters to you. Not what should matter, not what everyone says should matter. What really matters to Kawhi Leonard, the man, not the player." "Family," responded Kawhi without hesitation. "Okay, what else?" "Integrity. Being a good example for my children, using my platform for positive things." "Perfect. And I'm going to ask you a question. The people who are talking about you online, do they know you as a father? As a husband? As a man?" "No," admitted Kawhi. "So why are you giving them the power to define who you are?" What's most impressive is how a simple question can expose the irrationality of thought patterns we had accepted as natural. "Man," said Kawhi, and Steph could hear something moving in his voice. "I never thought about it that way." "That's because when we're in the middle of the storm, we lose perspective," explained Steph. "It's like being too close to a painting. You only see confused brush strokes. But when you step back, you can see the whole image." "And what's the whole image of my situation?" asked Kawhi. "The whole image," said Steph, "is that you are a good man who is facing a difficult moment. And difficult moments pass, Kawhi. They always pass. But who you are as a person, that stays. Something that touches deeply is realizing that our essential identity remains intact even when the circumstances around us are in complete chaos." "Steph," said Kawhi, and there was something that sounded almost like relief in his voice. "Thank you for reminding me of that. For reminding me of who I am underneath all this." "You're welcome, brother." "But, Kawhi." "Yes?" "This is just the beginning of the conversation. Now we need to talk about how you're going to get out of this." And it was at that moment that Steph Curry went from counselor to something much more powerful. He became the kind of friend who not only listens to problems, but actively helps solve them. What Steph would do next would show the difference between sympathy and true unconditional support. There is a moment in every crisis when the person in suffering needs to make a fundamental choice, continue fighting alone, or accept that there is a different way to face the storm. How is it possible that years of conditioning to be self-sufficient can crumble in a single conversation? "Steph," said Kawhi, his voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and hesitation, I don't know how to accept help. I know this sounds strange, but I never learned how to do this." Steph stopped walking around the kitchen and leaned against the counter, understanding that he had reached the most delicate moment of the conversation. It was the moment when Kawhi was about to tear down the last defenses he had built over a lifetime. "Kawhi," said Steph, his voice lowering to an almost whispered tone, "can I ask you a very direct question?" "You can." "When was the last time you really cried?" Great transformations begin when we allow repressed emotions to finally find their way out. And Steph was about to witness exactly that. The question hit Kawhi like an unexpected punch. There was a long silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone trying to control their breathing. I can't even remember," admitted Kawhi, his voice beginning to tremble again. "I always thought that crying was—" "Was what?" asked Steph gently. "Was weakness. Was losing control. Was was giving people ammunition to use against me. It was possible to perceive that Kawhi was verbalizing beliefs he had carried for decades, beliefs that now sounded absurd when said out loud. "Kawhi, man," said Steph, "you're talking to someone who cried on the court during the 2022 finals, in front of millions of people. And you know what happened? People respected me more, not less." "But you're different," protested Kawhi. "You were always more expressive. For me—" "For you, nothing," interrupted Steph with loving firmness. "You are a human being, Kawhi. Human beings cry. Human beings feel pain. Human beings need support. And anyone who judges you for that doesn't deserve even a second of your attention." What's most impressive is how Steph could dismantle years of toxic conditioning with a perfect combination of logic and compassion. And then it happened. Kawhi Leonard, the man who had become synonymous with emotional control, who had faced unimaginable pressures always maintaining the same serene expression, broke completely. The sound that came through the phone wasn't just crying. It was the release of years of accumulated pressure, of repressed emotions, of a vulnerability that had been denied for so long that when it finally emerged, it was like a dam bursting. "I can't anymore, Steph," sobbed Kawhi. "I can't pretend I'm okay. I can't pretend this isn't destroying me inside. I can't pretend I'm strong enough to handle all this alone." Steph felt tears forming in his own eyes. Not out of pity, but from recognizing the courage it took for a person like Kawhi to reach this point of total honesty. Great transformations begin when we allow repressed emotions to finally find their way out, and Steph was witnessing a transformation in real time. "Kawhi," said Steph, his own voice choked now. "Thank you." "For what?" asked Kawhi between sobs. "For trusting me enough to show me who you really are. For letting me be here with you in this moment. For giving me the honor of witnessing your humanity." Something that touches deeply is realizing that our vulnerability is not a burden we impose on others, but a gift we offer to those who truly care about us. "Steph, I feel lost," confessed Kawhi. "I don't know who I am when I'm not being the strong and silent guy. I don't know how to be vulnerable without feeling like I'm completely falling apart." "Then let's figure it out together," said Steph. And there was a determination in his voice that cut through the emotional confusion like a solid anchor. "Kawhi, you don't need to figure everything out alone. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to be strong all the time." "But how?" asked Kawhi. "How do I do this? How do I stop carrying everything alone without feeling like I'm failing?" Naturally, this leads us to question: why have we been conditioned to see the need for support as personal failure, when in reality it's just recognition of our shared humanity? "We start now," responded Steph. "We start with you letting me help you. Really. Not just with words, but with actions." "What do you mean?" Steph took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to offer would change the dynamic of everything. "I mean that tomorrow, if you want, I'll fly to Los Angeles. We'll spend the day talking. You'll get to know Isha better, get to know my family. We'll create a real plan for you to overcome this. Together." The silence that followed was different from all the others during the conversation. It was the silence of someone processing an offer that was beyond anything they had imagined asking for. "Steph," said Kawhi finally, "would you do that? Would you drop everything to come here?" "Kawhi, that's what brothers do," responded Steph without hesitation. "And you are my brother. You always have been, even when we didn't talk regularly. Some bonds transcend frequency of contact. It was impossible not to feel that that moment was redefining not only what friendship between elite athletes meant, but what genuine human support meant. I don't know what to say, whispered Kawhi. You don't need to say anything besides, yes, responded Steph. Let me come. Let me be physically present, not just on the phone line. Let us solve this the right way. Kawhi remained silent for a long moment, and Steph could feel that he was fighting against decades of conditioning that told him to refuse, to insist he was fine, to maintain the independence that had defined his identity. Great transformations begin when we allow repressed emotions to finally find their way out. But sometimes they are completed when we finally accept that we don't need to complete the journey alone. Yes, said Kawhi finally. Please, come. And in that moment, two things happened simultaneously. Kawhi Leonard accepted help for the first time in his adult life, and Steph Curry proved that true leadership is not about giving advice from afar, but about showing up physically when someone needs it. I'll be there tomorrow, promised Steph. And Kawhi? Yes? You just took the most important first step, stopping pretending you can do everything alone. We'll solve the rest together. What Steph did in the next 24 hours proved that some friendships are capable of transforming not only individuals, but redefining what true support means. There is a fundamental difference between offering help and materializing that help in reality. How is it possible that a promise made in a dawn phone call can transform into concrete actions that change the course of a life? At 2:30 p.m. the next day, Steph Curry was ringing the doorbell of Kawhi Leonard's house in Los Angeles. He had canceled two important commitments, reorganized his training schedule, and flown across the country because he had made a simple promise to show up when someone needed it. When Kawhi opened the door, Steph immediately saw the impact of the previous night. Kawhi's eyes were swollen, not just from crying, but from the first night of real sleep he had had in weeks. There was something different in his posture. He still carried weight, but he was no longer carrying it alone. You really came, said Kawhi, and there was a mixture of surprise and relief in his voice that broke Steph's heart. Of course I came, responded Steph, hugging his friend. I said I would come, so I came. Great promises come to life when we transform words into physical presence. And Steph was about to show exactly what that meant. They sat on the porch of Kawhi's house, overlooking the Los Angeles hills. It was a beautiful setting, but Steph could feel that the external beauty contrasted with the internal turmoil that Kawhi was still processing. How did you sleep? Asked Steph. Better than in the last 3 weeks, admitted Kawhi. After I hung up the phone, I felt like something had been released, like I finally had permission to stop pretending I was okay. It was possible to perceive that the dawn conversation had initiated a healing process that was just beginning. Kawhi, said Steph, I want us to use this time to create a real plan. Not just for you to get through this specific situation, but for you to learn to deal with pressure in a way that doesn't destroy you inside. How so? Steph leaned forward with that focused intensity that had made his performances so special. I want to teach you something my father taught me when I was fighting against my own internal pressure, said Steph. He told me, Steph, you can be like a tree or like a house in a storm. The house resists until it breaks. The tree bends and survives. What's most impressive is how Steph could translate complex concepts of emotional resilience into simple and powerful metaphors. Are you telling me to bend? Asked Kawhi, slightly confused. I'm telling you to stop trying to be inflexible, explained Steph. Kawhi, you've spent your entire life trying to be a fortress. But fortresses can be torn down. You need to learn to be like water. Like water? Water takes the shape of the container, but never loses its essence, continued Steph. You can adapt to circumstances without losing who you are. You can respond to pressure without being destroyed by it. Something that touches deeply is realizing that emotional flexibility is not weakness, but a superior form of strength that allows us to survive storms that would destroy rigid structures. Kawhi remained silent for a moment, processing the metaphor. But Steph, how do I do this in practice? Asked. How do I become water when everyone is watching me, judging every movement? First, said Steph, you stop trying to control what they think. Completely. You focus only on what you can control. Your actions, your choices, how you treat people, how you treat yourself. Great promises come to life when we transform words into physical presence, and Steph was transforming abstract concepts into practical strategies. Second, continued Steph, you create a real support system. Not just people who tell you what you want to hear, but people who keep you connected to who you really are. Like my family? Exactly. But also people like me. People who know you as a man, not just as an athlete. People who remind you of your values when you get lost in others' opinions. It was impossible not to feel that Steph was building an emotional safety net for Kawhi, structure by structure. Third, said Steph, you learn to process emotions in real time, instead of accumulating everything until you explode. That means talking about what you're feeling, not just with therapists, but with people who care about you. That's hard for me, admitted Kawhi. I know, but you've already started. Last night, you called me. Today, you let me come here. These are the first steps. Naturally, this leads us to question. How many times do we avoid the first steps of healing because they seem too small to make a difference, when in reality, they are the foundations of profound transformations? Steph pulled out his phone and showed Kawhi a photo of the Curry family gathered last Christmas. See this? Said Steph, pointing to the photo. This isn't a perfect family. Isha and I fight sometimes. The kids have difficult days. I have days when pressure catches me off guard. But you know what the difference is? What? We talk about everything. We don't keep anything. When I'm bad, I talk. When Isha is stressed, she talks. The kids know they can come to us with anything. Great promises come to life when we transform words into physical presence, and Steph was showing that real support manifests through consistent communication and shared vulnerability. Kawhi, continued Steph, I want you to promise me something. What? Promise that you'll start talking about what you're feeling. Not just in moments of crisis like yesterday, but regularly. With me, with your family, with whoever you trust. Kawhi hesitated for a moment. And if I don't know how to put into words what I'm feeling? Then you say, I don't know how to explain, but I'm bad, responded Steph. It doesn't need to be eloquent. It needs to be honest. Something that touches deeply is discovering that effective emotional communication doesn't require perfect articulation, just courage to begin. Steph, said Kawhi after a long moment, why are you doing this? Why are you investing so much time and energy in helping me? Steph smiled, looking at the Los Angeles hills. Because once, when I was at my lowest point after those 2016 finals, Draymond Green showed up at my house without me asking. He stayed the entire day with me, helped me process everything, reminded me of who I was beyond basketball. I didn't know that, because we don't talk about these things publicly. But they happen, and they matter. Draymond saved me that day, Kawhi. Today, I'm trying to do the same thing for you. It was possible to perceive that Steph was perpetuating a cycle of genuine support that had changed his own life years before. "And you know what else?" continued Steph. "You did the same thing for me last night, even without knowing it." "How so?" "You reminded me why I love this game, why I love this fraternity. You gave me the opportunity to be useful in a way that goes far beyond scoring points." Great promises come to life when we transform words into physical presence. And in that moment, both understood that true support is always a two-way street. In the days that followed, Steph Curry's actions would show the world that some lessons about humanity transcend any basketball court. How is it possible that a dawn conversation can create waves of change that spread far beyond the two people involved? Sometimes, the most private moments of vulnerability and support become the most universal lessons about what it means to be truly human. 3 weeks after that transformative call, Kawhi Leonard seemed like a different person. Not because his external challenges had disappeared, but because he had learned a completely new way to carry them. Great life lessons are born when we allow our vulnerability to become our strength. And Kawhi was living proof of this every day. He had begun having regular conversations not just with Steph, but with his own family. Conversations where he admitted when he was afraid, when he felt pressure, when he needed support. His wife would later say it was like getting back the husband who had been lost trying to be too strong. The deepest change, however, was in how Kawhi dealt with public pressure. Instead of trying to control external narratives, he had learned to focus only on what was under his direct control: how he treated his family, how he prepared professionally, how he contributed to his community. It was possible to perceive that Kawhi had internalized Steph's lesson about being like water, flexible enough to adapt to circumstances without losing his fundamental essence. Steph, in turn, discovered something powerful about leadership through that experience. He realized that true impact doesn't come just from athletic performance or public achievements, but from private moments where we choose to show up for people who need it. "You gave me a gift I didn't expect," said Kawhi during one of their follow-up conversations. "You taught me that asking for help doesn't make me less of a man. It makes me more human." What's most impressive is how that experience redefined both their perspectives on what really constitutes strength and success. The story eventually became public naturally, not through leaks or media speculation, but because both felt there was an important lesson that could help other men facing similar situations. During an interview months later, Steph was asked about how athletes can support each other beyond competition. "Sometimes," said Steph, "the most courageous thing we can do is admit we need help. And the most powerful thing we can do is be available when someone has the courage to ask." Something that touches deeply is realizing that our willingness to be vulnerable can create permission for others to do the same, creating waves of healing that spread far beyond our individual experience. Kawhi, who rarely spoke publicly about personal matters, made a simple but powerful statement. "I learned that real strength isn't never breaking. It's knowing how to rebuild yourself with help from people who care." Great life lessons are born when we allow our vulnerability to become our strength. And both Steph and Kawhi had become living examples of this truth. The most important lesson, however, was universal. In a world that constantly pressures us to be self-sufficient, having the courage to accept support and offer it genuinely can be the most revolutionary act of all. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how high we climb in our careers or how much fame we accumulate. We all need someone who is willing to answer the phone at 2 a.m. and say, "You are not alone."